Somewhere in the world tonight there is a stretch of dark water, quite narrow, with land close on either side. You could stand on one shore and see the other. A strong swimmer on a calm day could very nearly cross it. It is not wide, it is not grand. On a map of the whole world it is a tiny thing, a little pinch between two pieces of land that your eye would slide straight past. And through that narrow gap tonight is passing something like a fifth of all the oil that the entire world uses. Enormous ships, one after another, in a slow and endless procession, gliding through the dark. Each one, longer than the tallest building, is tall, riding low in the water, heavy with oil. And nearly all of the fuel that moves the cars and the factories and the power stations of half the planet must pass, single file, through this one slender channel of water. Now imagine that channel were blocked. Just that one. And within days, on the far side of the world, in a country that has never heard the name of that strait, the price of petrol begins to climb. Factories slow. Bills rise. The cost of 1,000 ordinary things in the shops of cities thousands of miles away quietly ticks upward. All because of a narrow stretch of water that you could very nearly swim across. This is the strange and enormous power of what are called choke points. The handful of narrow passages, the straits and canals through which the trade of the entire world is squeezed. They are among the most important places on Earth, and most of us could not name a single one of them or point to one on a map. Tonight, in the quiet, we are going to visit them. These slender, overlooked, staggeringly important places, we will find out why the whole vast trade of the world funnels through so few of them, why owning one is like owning a gate that everyone must pay to pass through, why a single ship stuck sideways can freeze the commerce of the planet, and why a passage does not even need to close to make the price of everything rise. It is a story of narrow water and immense consequence, and the hidden fragility beneath the world we take for granted. And it is best told slowly in the dark as you drift off to sleep. So, settle in. Turn the lights down low. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. Just rest and listen, and let the story carry you off across the dark water. Before we drift too far, there are two small things, and then I promise I will not ask anything of you again. First, if you enjoy these quiet journeys through the hidden lives of ordinary things, you can subscribe, and the next one will simply find you wherever you are, whenever you next need to sleep. And second, a small invitation for while you are still awake. Somewhere near you right now, there is an object so ordinary that you have stopped seeing it. A tin of food, a pair of shoes, a litre of fuel. Nearly all of them crossed an ocean to reach you through one of these narrow gates. Leave one in the comments below, just a word, and on some future night I may take it apart gently and show you the strange, hidden journey folded up inside it. And if you are listening from somewhere far away, a different country, a different time zone, a room I will never see, tell me where you are. I like to imagine all the quiet places these words travel to, in the dark, all around the turning world. One last thing. If by some small miracle you are still awake when we reach the very end of this, leave the word harbour in the comments, so I know who made it all the way through. Though I rather doubt you will, that after all is the whole point. Now, let's begin far out on the open ocean, where our story truly starts. To understand the power of the narrow places, you first have to understand something most of us never think about at all. How the things in your home actually got to you. Look around the room you are in. Almost everything you can see began its life somewhere else, very often on the far side of the world. The device you are listening on, the clothes in your wardrobe, the coffee in your cupboard, the fuel in your car, the steel in your appliances, the components inside nearly everything you own. And the overwhelming majority of it came to you the same way, by sea. We tend to picture global trade as aeroplanes and lorries and trains. And those matter, but they are a small part of the picture. The truth is that something like 80 or 90% of all the goods traded in the world travel by ship, across the oceans. In enormous vessels, most of which you will never see, moving quietly across the water, day and night, in their thousands all the time. The ocean is the real road of the modern world. Great, silent highway on which civilization actually runs. While we go about our lives on land, out on the dark water, there is a vast, ceaseless fleet carrying the physical substance of the entire global economy from where it is made to where it is wanted. And the ships that make up that fleet have grown, over the years, into some of the largest moving objects that human beings have ever built. The greatest of the container ships are longer than the tallest towers are tall. If you stood one on its end, it would rise higher than almost any building in the world. And it can carry many thousands of steel containers stacked upon its deck and deep in its holds, each one packed with the goods of ordinary life. A single such ship, on a single voyage, can carry enough cargo to fill a train that would stretch for dozens of miles. And there are thousands upon thousands of them. At any given moment, out on the oceans of the world, tens of thousands of large vessels are underway, moving quietly through the night. We almost never see them. They keep to the sea lanes far from shore, out of sight of the land. And so this enormous, endless, world-spanning fleet, upon which very nearly everything we own depends, passes its entire life almost completely unseen by the people it serves. It is one of the strangest facts of modern life, that the machine which brings us almost everything we have is, to almost all of us, entirely invisible. We see the shop and the shelf and the parcel at the door. We never see the great grey ship, months at sea, that carried the thing across the world to reach us. Now you might think that a road as wide as the ocean would have no bottlenecks at all. The sea is vast. There is room for everyone. Surely a ship can simply go wherever it likes. And on the open ocean, that is true. But ships do not only cross open oceans. They must get from one ocean to another, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, from the Persian Gulf out into the wider world. And the great oceans of the world are not open to one another. They are separated by land, by continents and peninsulas and islands that stand in the way. And so a ship, travelling from one part of the world to another, cannot simply sail in a straight line. It must find a way through, or around, the land that blocks its path. And here is the crucial thing. There are only a few such ways. A handful of narrow gaps where the land parts just enough to let the ships through, a few slender straits and a few great canals that human beings have dug through the land itself. Every ship, taking the sensible, short route between two great regions of the world, must pass through one of these few narrow gates. There is no other way, short of an enormous and costly detour. And so the trade of the entire planet, that vast ocean-wide flood of goods, is funneled again and again down into these few slender channels. That funneling is the whole story. The wide ocean squeezed into the narrow gate. And it is what gives these small, forgotten places their enormous, hidden power. Let us give this idea its proper name. The name that those who study trade and war and shipping have used for a very long time. A choke point? A narrow place through which a great flow must pass, and at which that flow can be choked. Word is borrowed from the body, in a sense. Think of an hourglass, and the narrow waist in the middle, through which all the sand must trickle. No matter how much sand is in the top, it can only pass through as fast as that narrow neck allows, and if you pinch the neck, the whole flow stops, though the sand above and below is untouched. The trade of the world has such necks. A small number of narrow marine passages where an astonishing share of everything must pass through a gap only a mile or two wide. There are, depending on how you count, perhaps half a dozen that truly matter. And each one is a place where geography has decided that the world must squeeze through a keyhole. There is a strait between a great gulf of oil and the open sea, through which much of the world's energy must pass. There is a strait between two great oceans, the busiest of them all, through which a quarter of the world's traded goods are said to flow. There is a canal cut through the desert that joins two seas and saves ships a journey of thousands of miles, and another canal cut through a narrow neck of land that joins two oceans and does the same. On a map, they are almost nothing. Tiny gaps, thin blue threads, little slivers you would never notice. And yet, through those few slivers passes the lifeblood of the modern world. The oil, the grain, the goods, the fuel, the components, the sheer physical stuff of everything. Think again of the hourglass and its narrow waist. The genius and the danger of the hourglass is that the whole flow is decided at that one slender point. It does not matter how much sand waits in the top, or how wide the chambers are above and below. All that matters, all that governs the flow, is the width of that single narrow neck. And the trade of the world is exactly like this. The oceans above and below are vast and open and free. But the flow between them is decided at the narrow necks. And whatever happens at those necks happens to everything. There is a beautiful and slightly frightening way to feel just how concentrated all this is. Consider that a very large share of everything traded on the entire planet passes through just a handful of these narrow places. Not 100 of them, not 50. A handful. You could name them all on the fingers of your two hands and have fingers left over. And each of those few places is not merely narrow. It is at its tightest point often only a mile or two of usable water. So that the true bottleneck, the actual pinch, the place where the whole flow is decided, is sometimes a channel you could see clear across on a fine day. The trade of 8 billion people, threaded through a gap you could take in with a single glance. When you truly hold that in your mind, the modern world begins to feel a little more precarious and a great deal more wondrous than it did before. That so vast a thing should balance upon so slender a set of points. it is a genuinely startling fact when you first sit with it. That a system as vast and as complex as the entire global economy, with its billions of people and its endless flood of goods, should rest in the end on a handful of narrow channels of water. That so much should depend on so few small places. And it means that these places carry a power out of all proportion to their size. Whoever controls one, or threatens one, or accidentally blocks one, holds a lever over the whole world. A tiny pinch of geography, with the power to move prices and topple plans and shake economies thousands of miles away. Let us go and visit them, one by one. Starting with the one that has, throughout modern history, caused the world the most sleepless nights. There is a narrow strait in the warm waters of the Middle East that may be the single most important stretch of water on the planet. It connects a great gulf, ringed by some of the most oil-rich nations on Earth, to the open ocean beyond. And it is the only sea route out. Every drop of oil that those nations sell by ship, and they sell a very great deal of it, must pass through this one strait to reach the wider world. It is not wide. At its narrowest, the strait is only around 20 miles across, and the lanes the great ships actually use are far narrower still, just a couple of miles wide in each direction. A tiny thread of water hemmed in by land. And through it passes something like a fifth of all the oil the entire world consumes. Around 20 million barrels of it every single day. Perhaps a quarter of all the oil that moves by sea anywhere on the planet funnels through this one narrow gap, along with a great share of the world's shipped natural gas as well. Think about the fragility of that. A fifth of the world's oil and much of its gas all squeezing every day through a channel you could nearly see across. The energy that powers factories and homes and vehicles across half the world threaded single file through one slender keyhole of water. And so, for as long as this trade has existed, this strait has been one of the most nervously watched places on Earth. Because everyone understands what would happen if it closed. If that one strait were blocked, even for a short time, the effect would be felt almost immediately all around the world. A fifth of the world's oil suddenly unable to reach the market. Price of oil would leap upward, and because oil is in everything, moves everything, makes everything, the price of 1,000 other things would follow: petrol, heating, transport, plastics, food, which must be grown and shipped and delivered, all using fuel. The parts of the world that depend most heavily on the oil from that gulf, much of it flowing east to the great economies of Asia, would feel it first and worst. Shortages, soaring prices, a sudden painful squeeze on the fuel that runs their entire lives. And the strange thing is how quickly the pain would travel to places that have nothing to do with that gulf at all. Because the price of oil is a single global price. Oil is traded all over the world, and when a fifth of the supply is suddenly threatened, the price does not rise only for those who buy from that one region. It rises for everyone, everywhere, all at once. A country on the far side of the planet that buys not a single barrel from that gulf would still see its own fuel grow dearer within days, simply because the world price had jumped. That is the terrible reach of it. A disturbance at one narrow strait, spreading outward across the whole connected world, touching the price of fuel in every nation, whether they trade through that strait or not. And so this strait has been watched and worried over for a very long time. Again and again, across the decades, it has been the subject of threats and warnings and tense standoffs. The nation that sits along its shore has more than once warned that it might close the strait if it were pushed too far. And each time the world has held its breath, and the price of oil has trembled because everyone understands exactly what is at stake. It has become, in a sense, the most valuable threat in the world. The ability to reach out and pinch that one narrow neck and make the entire planet flinch. Power that comes not from wealth or from armies, but simply from geography. From happening to sit beside the narrow gate through which the world's oil must pass. And this is not a distant hypothetical. The world has been reminded more than once, and recently, how real this danger is. When tensions in that region flare into conflict, the great ships grow afraid to make the passage. Traffic through the strait can collapse almost overnight, as vessel after vessel decides the risk is too great, and the price of oil, watching all this, begins at once to climb. A narrow strait in a troubled corner of the world. The power in its closing to reach into the life of nearly every person on the planet and make the world a little poorer and a little colder and a little more afraid. That is the power of a choke point. And it is not even the busiest one. Far to the east, between the islands and peninsulas of Southeast Asia, there is another strait. And by some measures, it is the busiest and most important of them all. It is a long, narrow channel of water that runs between great land masses, and it forms the shortest sea route between the oil fields and factories of the west and the enormous, hungry economies of the east. If you want to carry goods or oil from the Middle East or Europe or Africa to the vast markets of Eastern Asia, this is the way you go. And so an immense share of the world's trade pours through it. As much as a quarter, by some accounts, of all the traded goods on Earth. And even more oil than passes through that famous Strait of the Middle East. It is, in fact, the single busiest oil choke point in the world, carrying close to a third of all the oil that moves by sea. Picture the traffic. Tens of thousands of ships a year threading through this one channel. Great tankers and towering container ships and bulk carriers heavy with grain and ore, all funneling through a passage that narrows at one famous point to only a mile or two of navigable water. A mile or two of water, carrying a quarter of the trade of the world. The sheer density of it is difficult to imagine. A near constant stream of the largest moving objects humanity builds, nose to tail, through a narrow tropical channel day and night, year upon year. It is one of the great unseen wonders of the modern world, a river of ships carrying the substance of civilization that almost no one ever thinks about. And like all choke points, it has its vulnerabilities. For much of its history, these crowded, narrow waters were haunted by piracy, as they funneled so much wealth through so tight a space that they drew those who would prey upon it. And the same nightmare hangs over it as over every choke point, that some accident or conflict or blockage might one day pinch this narrow neck and choke a quarter of the world's trade in a single stroke. And there is a beautiful lesson in what such a choke point does to the land beside it. For where the ships must funnel, wealth gathers. At the far end of this great strait sits one of the richest and most successful cities in the world, a small island nation that grew fabulously prosperous for one simple reason. It sits exactly at the pinch point where all those ships must pass. It built harbours and refineries and vast facilities to serve the endless river of vessels. It became the place where the ships stop and refuel and trade and repair. A whole glittering economy raised up out of almost nothing simply by standing at the narrow gate and serving those who pass through it. The choke point made the city, as choke points throughout history have made the fortunes of whoever was clever enough to sit beside them. This is worth remembering because it is the gentler face of the same power. A narrow place does not only threaten, it also enriches. To sit beside the gate through which the world must pass is to have the world come to your door again and again with money in its hand. So far, the great river of ships flows on uninterrupted. Quietly, reliably, almost miraculously. Carrying, through one slender gap between the islands, an enormous share of everything the modern world consumes. Picture it one more time before we move on. The warm tropical night, the dark water, and the lights of the ships, hundreds of them, strung out along the channel like a slow river of stars, each one a floating mountain of steel and cargo, gliding patiently through the narrow dark toward the great hungry cities of the East. It has been flowing like this, night after night, for longer than any of us has been alive, and almost no one in all the sleeping cities it feeds has ever given it a single thought. But not all the great gates of the world were made by nature. Some of the most important human beings dug for themselves. There is a place where a great ship appears to sail straight through the desert, where if you stand in the sand and look out, you can see the towering hull of a container ship gliding past, seemingly across dry land, as though the sea had reached inland to carry it. It is one of the strangest and most wonderful sights in the world. It is a canal. A vast artificial channel cut straight through a narrow neck of desert, joining two great seas that were once separated by land. And it is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure ever built by human hands. Before it existed, a ship sailing from Europe to Asia faced a truly enormous journey. All the way down the length of Africa, around its southern tip, and back up the other side. A voyage of many thousands of extra miles and many extra weeks. And then, over a century and a half ago, this canal was cut through the desert, joining the two seas. And suddenly, a ship could pass straight through from one side to the other. The journey between Europe and Asia was shortened by thousands of miles and well over a week of sailing in a single stroke. The building of it was an epic in its own right. It took 10 years and vast armies of labourers digging through the desert by hand and by machine to carve a channel 100 miles long through the sand, joining the two seas. It was one of the great engineering dreams of its age, doubted by many and enormously costly, and when at last the two seas were joined and the first ships passed through, it changed the shape of the world's trade forever. The effect on the world was profound. Distance, which is really just time and cost, collapsed. Trade between the two great regions of the world became faster and cheaper, and the whole map of global commerce was quietly redrawn around this one narrow ditch. And the canal became so valuable that it was fought over and closed and reopened across its long history. There was a time within living memory when this canal was shut completely by war for the better part of a decade. 8 long years during which not a single ship could pass, and the whole vast flow of trade had to go the long way round, all the way around Africa, as it had in the centuries before the canal was ever dug. Some ships were even trapped inside the canal itself when it closed, and sat there in the desert waterway for years, their crews rotating in and out, the sand slowly gathering on their decks. It is a strange and vivid reminder that these gates are not permanent, that a passage carrying 1/10 of the world's trade can simply shut and stay shut for years when human quarrels demand it, and that the world, though it groans and pays the price, somehow carries on taking the long way round until the gate opens once again. Today, something like 1/10 of all the world's seaborne trade passes through this single canal, and a much larger share of certain goods, a great deal of the world's container traffic, a striking share of the cars shipped between continents, a slender artificial thread of water through the desert carrying 1/10 of the trade of the planet. And the country through which it runs has, for generations, drawn enormous benefit from simply owning the gate. For every ship that passes through must pay a toll, often enormous, for the privilege of taking the shortcut rather than the long way round. We will come back to that idea of charging for passage because it is one of the most beautiful pieces of economics in the whole story. But first we have to see what happens when a gate like this, carrying 1/10 of the world's trade, is suddenly, accidentally, completely blocked. Because it happened not so long ago, and the world watched, half in horror and half in disbelief, as the entire global economy was held hostage by a single stuck ship. It began, as these things often do, with the weather and an ordinary morning and one very large ship. A container ship, one of the largest in the world, longer than the tallest skyscrapers laid on their side, was passing through that great canal in the desert. And something went wrong. A strong wind, perhaps, or a moment of poor visibility, or a small error at the helm. And this vast ship swung sideways. And because the canal was only a little wider than the ship was long, the vessel wedged itself completely across the channel. Its bow buried in one bank, its stern in the other. A single enormous ship jammed diagonally across the waterway like a cork driven into the neck of a bottle. The canal was blocked. Utterly. One of the busiest trade routes on Earth, carrying 1/10 of the world's commerce, brought to a complete and total stop by one ship stuck sideways in the sand. What happened next was extraordinary to watch, because a choke point, once choked, backs up with astonishing speed. Behind the stuck ship, a queue began to form, and it grew. Ship after ship arriving at the canal, finding it blocked and dropping anchor to wait. Within days, the line of waiting vessels numbered in the hundreds. Some 400 ships eventually, floating idle, laden with goods, unable to move, stacked up at both ends of the blocked canal, like traffic at a broken bridge. And the cost of all this was almost incomprehensible. By some estimates, the value of the trade held up by that single stuck ship ran to around $9 billion. Every single day. $9 billion a day. Frozen. Because one ship was stuck sideways in a ditch. And the queue was not the whole of it. Behind those 400 waiting ships stood the factories and the shops and the customers, all along the chains those ships were feeding. Goods that factories were waiting for did not arrive. Shipments that shops had ordered sat motionless in the desert. The delicate, just-in-time supply chains of the modern world, which assume that everything will always keep moving, seized up and stuttered, all because of one blockage in one narrow place. For this is the hidden truth of how the modern world makes things. It does not keep great warehouses full of spare parts and stockpiled goods waiting to be used. That would cost too much. Instead, it has learned to have things arrive just as they are needed, and not a moment before. A factory expects its parts to come on the day it needs them. A shop expects its stock to arrive just as the shelves empty. It is a marvel of efficiency. And it works beautifully as long as everything keeps moving. But it means there is very little slack in the system, very little held in reserve. So when the flow stops, even briefly, there is no great cushion of stored goods to fall back on. The shortage begins to bite almost at once. And so a single ship, stuck for a few days in one narrow ditch, sent tremors down supply chains all across the planet. Deliveries delayed by weeks, prices nudged upward, factories thousands of miles away, forced to slow their lines because a part they needed was floating, uselessly, in a queue behind a grounded ship in the desert. The whole vast, clever, efficient machine revealed in an instant to be far more fragile than anyone lying in bed at night had ever imagined. There was even something darkly comic about it, which is partly why the whole world watched. The sheer absurd smallness of the cause against the vastness of the effect. One ship, turned slightly the wrong way by a gust of wind, holding the entire commerce of the planet to ransom for the better part of a week, while tiny diggers scratched hopefully at the sand around its enormous bow. For the better part of a week, the world watched, transfixed, as small diggers, looking almost comically tiny, against the vast wall of the ship's hull, scraped away at the sand, trying to free it. And slowly, with the tides and the tugs and the digging, the great ship was at last worked loose and swung free, and the canal reopened, and the enormous, backed-up flood of trade began, slowly, to move again. But the lesson lingered. The whole world had seen in a single vivid image just how fragile the great machine really is. How a tenth of global trade could be halted by one accident in one narrow place. How much depends on how little. And there is another great canal on the far side of the world that teaches the same lesson in a different and even stranger way. On the other side of the planet there is a narrow neck of land joining two great continents and separating two great oceans. For all of history, a ship wanting to pass from one of those oceans to the other faced a monstrous journey, all the way down to the very bottom of a continent, around its stormy southern tip and back up the other side. A voyage of some 8,000 extra miles. And so, a little over a century ago, human beings performed one of the greatest feats of engineering ever attempted. They cut a canal straight through that narrow neck of land joining the two oceans. But this canal was not like the one through the desert, because this neck of land was not flat. It rose in the middle into hills. And you cannot simply cut a sea-level channel through a range of hills, so the builders did something ingenious instead. They built a staircase of water. The canal uses great chambers called locks. Ship sails into a chamber, and the gates close behind it, and water pours in, and the ship rises, floating upward, lifted by the water as though climbing a step. And then it sails into the next chamber, and rises again. Step by step, the ships are lifted up and over the hills in the middle, floated across a lake at the top, and then gently lowered, chamber by chamber, down the other side to the far ocean. It is a breathtaking thing to picture. Enormous ocean-going ships climbing a staircase of water over a mountain range to cross from one ocean to another. The building of this canal was one of the hardest and most costly things human beings had ever attempted. The land it crossed was thick jungle, steaming and wet and riddled with disease. An earlier attempt to dig it had failed completely, defeated by the mud and the sickness, and the sheer scale of the task after enormous sums had been spent and many thousands of lives had been lost. Only later, after long study and the taming of the diseases that had killed so many, was the canal finally completed and the two oceans joined at last. It was and remains one of the wonders of the modern world. A place where you can stand and watch the largest ships on Earth climb quietly over a continent, lifted by nothing but water, and pass from one great ocean into another. And it saves them that vast, dangerous 8,000-mile journey around the bottom of the continent. So, like the desert canal, it became a vital artery of world trade, carrying a great share of the goods that moved between the two oceans, and an especially large share of the trade of the nations nearby. And it saves them that vast, dangerous 8,000-mile journey around the bottom of the continent. So, the desert canal, it became a vital artery of world trade, carrying a great share of the goods that moved between the two oceans, and an especially large share of the trade of the nations nearby. But this canal has a peculiar weakness, and it is a beautiful and troubling one. Those locks that lift the ships up the staircase need water. Enormous quantities of it. Every time a ship is raised and lowered, a vast volume of fresh water is used, drained away to lift the vessel, and that water comes from rain, gathered in the lake at the top. And in recent years the rains have sometimes failed. Drought has come to the canal, and the lake has fallen low, and there has not been enough water to work the locks as often as before. And so the canal has had to slow down to let fewer ships through each day to conserve its precious water. And here is where it becomes wonderful economics. When the canal could take fewer ships, a place in the queue suddenly became precious. And the canal began to auction off the few available slots to the highest bidder. And ships, desperate to avoid the 8,000-mile detour, bid enormous sums for a place. On at least one occasion, a single company reportedly paid millions of dollars over and above the ordinary toll, simply to jump the queue and pass through without waiting. Millions of dollars. Just to move to the front of the line at a narrow gate because the rains had not come. Price of the passage soaring as the water ran low. There is a whole lesson in economics folded into that single, strange fact. When something becomes scarce, its price does not rise gently. It can leap wildly to astonishing heights, driven by those who most desperately need it. A slot through the canal, in ordinary times, costs a set and reasonable toll. But make those slots suddenly few, and let the ships bid against one another for the handful that remain, and the price can climb to a level that would seem insane in normal times. Because for a ship facing the alternative, an 8,000-mile detour, costing far more still, even a few $1 million to jump the queue can be the sensible, cheaper choice. And there is something quietly profound in the cause of it all. That the flow of the world's trade through this mighty canal should depend in the end on the rain. On whether the clouds gather over a particular lake, in a particular set of hills, in a particular season. The grandest engineering, the vast ships, the billions of dollars of trade, all of it resting ultimately on something as old and as uncontrollable as the weather. As the world's climate shifts and the old patterns of rain grow less reliable, this is a vulnerability that may only deepen. Choke point that can be squeezed not by war or by accident, but simply by a dry season. The narrow gate at the mercy of the sky. Which brings us to the deep and elegant economics that runs beneath all of these places. The economics of owning a gate that the whole world must pass through. Imagine you owned a bridge. The only bridge across a wide and dangerous river on the single road between two great cities. You did not build the cities. You do not make the goods that travel the road, or drive the carts, or take any of the risk of trade. You simply own the one narrow point that everyone must cross. What a position that would be. Because everyone who wishes to pass must come to you and pay whatever you ask. Because you have done anything for them, particularly but simply because you control the narrow place and there is no other way through. This is one of the oldest and most powerful ideas in all of economics. The idea of the toll, of rent, of the money you can charge, not for making something, but simply for controlling a point that others must pass through. And a great canal is exactly such a point. A gate that a tenth of the world's trade must pass through. And the nation that owns it charges every single ship for the passage. The tolls are enormous. A single large ship passing through one of these canals may pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the privilege. And ship after ship pays it, day after day, year after year. For the country that owns the gate, it is one of the great reliable rivers of income in the world. Billions of dollars a year, gathered simply by owning a narrow place and charging the world to pass. And notice how willingly the ships pay. Because the alternative, the long way round, is so much worse. Ship weighing up whether to pay the canal's steep toll or to sail the many extra thousands of miles around a continent will do the arithmetic, the extra fuel, the extra weeks, the wages of the crew for all that added time, the cargo arriving late. Very often, the enormous toll is still the cheaper choice, so they pay it gladly and pass through. That is the quiet genius of owning a choke point. You can charge right up to the point where paying you becomes just barely cheaper than the terrible alternative. And since the alternative is a journey thousands of miles, you can charge a very great deal indeed. Economists have a name for money earned this way. They call it rent. Not the rent you pay for a home, though that is related, but a deeper idea. Rent, in this sense, is income you earn not from producing anything or from any effort or skill, but simply from controlling something that others need and cannot get elsewhere. The owner of the only bridge earns rent. The owner of the only well in a desert earns rent. the owner of a great canal through which a tenth of the world must pass, earns rent on a colossal scale. They did not make the trade. They did not make the goods. They simply happen to control the narrow place, and so the whole world must pay them forever for the privilege of passing through. It is one of the most enviable positions in all of economics, one of the most enduring. For a business that makes a product must compete and innovate and worry about rivals who might make it better or cheaper, but the owner of the only gate has no such worries. There is no rival gate. There is no better way through. The ships must come and pay and come again tomorrow and the next day and the next, as they have for generations. There is a reason that throughout history, the shrewdest and most powerful have always sought to control the narrow places. The mountain passes, the river crossings, the city gates, the straits and the canals. Because to hold the narrow place is to hold a gentle, permanent claim on everyone who must pass. It is the oldest money machine there is, far older than the factory or the shop or the bank, as old as the first person who stood at the only ford across a river and asked the travellers for a coin. We have seen this shape before on these quiet nights. The owner of the one thing everyone needs, charging all who must pass. The casino that owns the game. The organisation that owns the world's football tournament. The company that owns the one road or the one gate. It is the power of the bottleneck, the profit that comes not from making, but from controlling the narrow place. But there is a subtler power in these gates still. One that does not even require the gate to close or the toll to rise. A power that works through fear alone. And to understand it, we have to talk about insurance. Here is the most subtle and surprising idea in the whole of our story. A choke point does not actually have to close to cause enormous damage. It only has to become frightening. To see why, you have to understand a quiet, invisible thing that sits behind all of world trade. Insurance. Every one of those great ships and every cargo it carries is insured against storm and accident and loss. Because the ships and their cargoes are worth so much, no owner would ever risk sending one across the world without protection against disaster. And the cost of that insurance depends naturally on the risk. A calm, safe voyage costs little to insure. A dangerous one costs a great deal. Now imagine that a choke point becomes dangerous. Not blocked, not closed, just risky. Perhaps there is conflict nearby, perhaps ships are being threatened or attacked, perhaps the danger is only a possibility, a rumour, a fear. The insurers notice at once, and they raise their prices for any ship wishing to pass through that dangerous water. A special steep additional premium for braving the risky strait. Sometimes the cost of insuring a single passage leaps many times over in a matter of days. And suddenly, the arithmetic changes for every ship. Passage that was cheap and easy is now burdened with an enormous new cost. The captains and the owners begin to do their sums again, and many of them decide that the risky strait with its soaring insurance is no longer worth it, and they turn away and take the long way round instead. Do you see what has happened? The choke point never closed. No gate was shut. No ship was sunk, perhaps. But the mere fear of danger, expressed through the cold arithmetic of insurance, was enough to empty the strait and send the world's trade on the long, costly detour, exactly as if it had been physically blocked. This is a profound and slightly unsettling idea, that you do not need to actually close a choke point to choke it. You only need to make it frightening enough that the price of passing becomes too high. Fear alone does the work. The risk itself is the weapon. And the beauty and the horror of it, from the point of view of anyone who might wish to disrupt the world, is how little it takes. You do not need a great navy. You do not need to defeat anyone. You need only to make a narrow stretch of water frightening enough that the insurers take notice. A few small attacks, a credible threat, enough danger to move the numbers, and the market does the rest all on its own, emptying the strait through the cold and rational choices of 1,000 ship owners, each simply protecting themselves. This has happened in recent years in more than one place. A stretch of sea near a troubled coast became dangerous as ships passing through were threatened and attacked. And though most ships were never touched, the danger was enough. The insurance costs soared, and a great share of the traffic that once flowed through that route simply stopped and turned away, and took the long path around a whole continent instead. The route was never formally closed. The market closed it through fear and arithmetic as surely as any barricade. It is one of the reasons these narrow places are so powerful and so dangerous, because they can be disrupted without a single shot truly landing where it matters. Threat, a rumour, a climate of danger, is enough to raise the price of fear and reroute the trade of the world. And notice what an unusual kind of power that is. It is the power of possibility, of maybe. The mere possibility of harm hanging over a narrow place is enough to change the behaviour of the entire world without the harm ever needing to arrive. We like to think that only real events have real consequences. But in the strange economics of the narrow places, fear itself is an event, and it can move the price of everything on the strength of something that has not even happened. And when the world's trade takes the long way round, everyone, everywhere, quietly pays. Let us follow one of those ships as it turns away from the frightening strait and takes the long route instead. Around the bottom of a continent. The old way, the way ships went before the canals were cut. It is a very long way. The detour can add many thousands of miles and well over a week, sometimes two, to the journey. And every mile of that added distance has a cost. There is the fuel. Enormous ships burn enormous quantities of it, and thousands of extra miles means a great deal of extra fuel at great expense. There is the crew, who must be paid for every extra day at sea. There is the ship itself, tied up for longer on each voyage, and so able to make fewer voyages in a year, which is a cost of its own. And there is the cargo arriving late. The goods that a factory was waiting for, that now come a fortnight after they were needed, the seasonal products that miss their season, the delicate supply chains stretched and strained by the delay. Add it all together, and rerouting the world's trade around a continent instead of through a choke point costs a staggering amount. Crucial thing. That cost does not simply vanish or fall only on the shipping companies. It flows outward into the price of everything. And there is a further, subtler cost beyond the fuel and the time. When ships must suddenly take the long way round, the whole world's fleet is, in effect, made smaller. For if every voyage now takes 2 weeks longer, then each ship can make fewer voyages in a year, and so without a single vessel being lost, the carrying power of the entire global fleet quietly shrinks. There are effectively fewer ships to go around. And when there are fewer ships chasing the same amount of cargo, the price of shipping itself climbs. Cost of hiring a vessel can double or more in the space of weeks. So the detour strikes twice, once through the direct cost of the longer voyage, and again through the rising price of shipping everywhere as the world's carrying capacity is stretched thin. And all of this, every bit of it, ends up woven into the price of things. When it becomes more expensive to move goods across the world, the goods themselves become more expensive. And that added cost is passed along, from the shipper to the importer to the shop to you, quietly folded into the price of 1,000 ordinary items on 1,000 ordinary shelves. This is how a distant strait in a troubled corner of the world reaches into your life. Not with drama, not with headlines you would connect to your own home, but quietly through the slow machinery of shipping costs and prices, nudging up the cost of your fuel, your food, your furniture, your clothes by a little, all at once. It is a form of the thing everyone complains about, and few truly understand. The rising cost of living. And part of it, more than you would ever guess, is decided out on the dark water, at a handful of narrow gates thousands of miles from where you sleep. When the gates flow freely, the world is a little cheaper and a little richer, and does not notice. When the gates are threatened, the world is a little poorer and a little more expensive, and does not quite understand why. The narrow places, quietly setting the price of ordinary life for everyone, everywhere. Because choke points hold such power, they have always been more than places of trade. They have been places of strategy, of leverage, of pressure. For if a narrow place can choke the world's trade, then whoever can threaten that place holds a weapon of extraordinary power. A way to squeeze the whole world by pinching a single point. This is why throughout history, nations have fought and schemed and stationed their fleets around these narrow waters. Why great powers have gone to enormous lengths to control them, or to keep them open, or to be able to close them if they chose. The narrow places are the pressure points of the entire global body. And everyone who plays the great game of nations knows exactly where they are. A nation that sits beside a vital strait holds a card of immense value. The ability, in a crisis, to threaten the passage. To make the ships afraid, to raise the price of fear, to reach out through that one narrow place and touch the economy of the entire world. This is the reason that so much of the map of history was drawn around the narrow places. The great empires of the past understood their power perfectly. They built their fleets to control the straits. They planted their forts and their colonies at the choke points of the world, not always for the land itself, but for the gate it commanded. To hold the narrow place was to hold a hand upon the throat of trade, and everyone who wished to prosper had to reckon with you. And the strange thing is how little this has changed for all our modern cleverness. We have satellites and aircraft and instant communication across the whole planet. And yet the physical stuff of the world, the oil and the grain and the goods, still moves by ship through the same few narrow gates it always has. And so those gates remain, as they have always been, among the most strategically precious places on Earth. The technology changes, the geography does not. The narrow place is still the narrow place, and whoever commands it still holds the old power. There is a quiet game being played around these gates all the time in the background of the peaceful world. A constant, watchful balancing among the powerful nations over who controls what and who could threaten what and who would respond and how. It rarely makes the news, it rarely erupts into anything you would notice, but it is always there, humming beneath the surface of ordinary trade, a slow and careful contest for the narrow places upon which so much depends. And this is a delicate and dangerous kind of power because it invites response. The world does not like to see its vital gates threatened. And so, around the most important choke points, there is often a quiet, constant presence of the great navies of the world, watching, guarding, keeping the narrow places open, because so much depends on their remaining so. There is something almost paradoxical in it. That the free and open flow of peaceful trade, the ordinary business of ships carrying goods, should rest, in the end, on the quiet presence of warships guarding the narrow gates. That the gentle machinery of global commerce should have, at its most vulnerable points, this hard edge of force, keeping the way clear. But so it is. The narrow places are too important to be left to chance. And so they are watched and guarded and fought over and negotiated about endlessly in the background of a world that goes about its shopping without ever knowing. And there is a newer twist to this old story that is worth a quiet moment. Because it is not only ships and oil that pass through these narrow places now. Along the beds of many of these same straits and seas run the great cables that carry the world's information. The messages, the money, the endless flow of data that the modern world runs on, threaded through many of the very same narrow corridors. So that these ancient pinch points of trade are becoming the pinch points of information too. The narrow places growing more important, not less, as the world grows more connected. Which leads us to the deepest lesson of all. The one that explains why the world was ever built this fragile in the first place. Here is a question you might well ask by now. If these narrow gates are so dangerous, so fragile, so full of risk, why does the world rely on them so completely? Why not spread the trade out? Why not build in more ways through more routes, more safety? The answer is one of the deepest ideas in all of economics. And it is a genuine trade-off with no easy escape. The world funnels its trade through these narrow places because they are efficient. Because they are the shortest, cheapest, fastest way. The canal saves thousands of miles. The strait is the direct route. Passing through the narrow gate is, in ordinary times, simply the best and cheapest thing to do. And a world that is always seeking the cheapest, fastest way, as our world relentlessly is, will naturally pour more and more of its trade through these efficient, narrow points. Because every ship that takes the short route saves money. And saved money in trade is everything. But here is the hidden cost of all that efficiency. Fragility. When you concentrate a great flow through a single narrow point, because it is the most efficient path, you also create a single point of failure. A place where one accident, one conflict, one blockage can halt the entire flow. The very efficiency that makes the narrow gate so attractive is exactly what makes the whole system so vulnerable. There is a deep and general truth here that reaches far beyond ships. The most efficient system is almost never the most resilient one. To be maximally efficient is to cut away every spare part, every backup, every redundant path, every wasteful margin until nothing remains but the single, leanest way of doing things. And a system with nothing spare, nothing held in reserve, no other way through, is a system that shatters the moment its single path is broken. Resilience, by contrast, is expensive. It means having more than you strictly need. More routes than the cheapest one. More stock than the leanest amount. Spare capacity, sitting idle, ready for a crisis that may never come. And in the ordinary run of things, all of that looks like waste. It costs money and returns nothing day after day until the moment disaster strikes and it is suddenly the only thing that saves you. Our world, for decades, chose efficiency. Relentlessly. The shortest routes, the leanest supply chains, the just-in-time delivery, the single cheapest path for everything, and it made the world richer and cheaper and more connected than ever before. But it also made it fragile, concentrated, dependent on a handful of narrow gates, all flowing freely all the time. You can see the very same trade-off in a single human life. The person who spends every penny they earn keeping nothing in reserve is living at maximum efficiency. Not a coin is wasted sitting idle in savings. But let one thing go wrong, one unexpected bill, one lost job, and they are in crisis at once because there was nothing held back. The person who keeps a little saved, who holds something in reserve against trouble, is less efficient in a sense. That saved money earns little sitting there, but they are far more resilient. When the storm comes, they can weather it. The whole world made the first choice, not the second. It spent everything on efficiency and kept almost nothing in reserve. It built its supply chains lean and its routes short, and its stockpiles thin, and funneled everything through the cheapest narrow gates, because in the ordinary run of things, that was simply the cheapest way to live. And for a long time, it worked beautifully. Goods flowed, the prices fell, the world grew richer and more connected than it had ever been. The reserves we gave up, the spare routes, the extra stock, the redundant capacity, all looked, in the good years, like wisdom. Why pay for a second path you never use? Why store what you can simply order to arrive tomorrow? But the bill for that choice does not disappear. It only waits. It sits quietly, invisible, through all the good years, and then falls due all at once on the day a gate is threatened, or a ship swings sideways, or rain fails to come. We traded resilience for cheapness. Mostly without noticing we were doing it. And every so often, when a gate is threatened, or a ship gets stuck, the bill for that trade comes quietly due. There is no simple answer to this, by the way. It is a genuine trade-off, not a mistake to be corrected. For all that spare capacity, all those extra routes and reserves would cost enormous sums to build and to keep. And in every year that disaster did not strike, that cost would look like waste, and someone would ask, quite reasonably, why we were paying for safety we never seemed to need. It is the eternal, difficult balance between the cheapness that serves us in good times and the resilience that saves us in bad, and there is no way to have the full measure of both at once. Let us gather up what these narrow gates have shown us as the night deepens. There is first the lesson of the bottleneck. that enormous power can rest in a very small place, that controlling a narrow point through which others must pass is one of the oldest and surest forms of power there is. The one who keeps the gate need not make anything or risk anything. They need only own the narrow place and charge the world to pass. There is the lesson of the toll, that you can charge for passage right up to the point where paying you is just barely better than the terrible alternative. And that when the alternative is a journey of thousands of miles, the toll can be very steep indeed and still be gladly paid. There is the lesson of the price of fear, that you do not need to close a gate to choke it, that risk itself, expressed through the quiet arithmetic of insurance, can empty a strait as surely as any blockade, that fear alone can reroute the trade of the world and lift the price of ordinary life without a single gate ever being shut. There is the lesson of the detour, that the cost of the long way round does not vanish, but flows outward into the price of everything, quietly reaching through the machinery of shipping and prices all the way into your own home. And there is the deepest lesson of all. Trade-off between efficiency and resilience. That the leanest, cheapest, most efficient way of doing things is almost always the most fragile. That every spare route we remove to save money is a safety we give up. And that a world optimized entirely for cheapness will, sooner or later, discover the price of having nothing held in reserve. All of that hidden in a few narrow stretches of dark water that most of us will never see and could not name. Quiet gates through which the whole material world must pass. There is something humbling in it, I think, to realize how much of the vast, complex modern world rests upon so few small places. That the shirt on your back, and the fuel in your car, and the food on your table very likely passed, in the dark, through one of these narrow gates, guided by people you will never meet, guarded by ships you will never see, at the mercy of a fragile peace you never think about. And there is one more lesson, quieter than the rest, that the narrow places whisper. It is about noticing, about how much of the world runs on things we never see and never thank and never think about until the day they fail. Gates flow freely almost always. Because they flow freely, we forget they are there at all. We forget that our fuel and our food and nearly everything we own made a long and perilous journey through narrow water to reach us. We forget the ships and the crews and the pilots and the fragile peace that all had to hold for the ordinary miracle of a full shelf to occur. We only remember when something breaks. That is true of so much in life when you think about it. The things that serve us most faithfully are the things we notice least. The heart that beats without being asked, the water that comes when we turn the tap, the narrow gates far away through which the whole world quietly flows, night after night, holding up a life we imagine we built entirely for ourselves. We move through our days imagining the world to be solid and settled and sure. And mostly it is. But it flows in the end through keyholes. And the keyholes are narrower and fewer and more precious than we ever quite let ourselves believe. And yet let us end on a gentler thought. Because for all their fragility, the remarkable thing about the narrow gates of the world is not how often they fail. It is how rarely they do. Night after night, year after year, the great ships pass through the straits and the canals in their tens of thousands quietly, safely, without incident. The oil flows, the goods move, the gates stay open. And the vast, improbable machine of the world keeps running so smoothly that we forget it is running at all. It is worth pausing sometimes to feel the quiet wonder of that. That right now, as you lie here in the dark, there are ships gliding through narrow, moonlit straits on the far side of the world, carrying the substance of your ordinary life toward you, threading the keyholes, keeping the shelves full and the fuel flowing, and the lights on in 1,000 cities of sleeping people who will never give it a moment's thought. There are pilots awake now in the night, guiding great vessels through tight and difficult waters with enormous skill. There are crews far from home, standing quiet watches on dark bridges. There are the keepers of the gates and the guardians of the straits, all doing their small parts to keep the narrow places open and the world flowing. It is a kind of vast, invisible act of cooperation, involving millions of people and countless ships and a fragile web of trust and habit and shared interest stretched across the whole turning planet. Mostly it holds. Mostly the gates stay open. Mostly the ships pass through and the world goes on, and none of us ever knows how close to the narrow places our ordinary lives are really lived. And tonight, at least, the gates are open, and the ships are passing through, and you can rest. So let us come back now to where we started. To a single great ship, gliding slowly through a narrow strait under the moon, with a dark land close on either side, and the rain falling softly on a window very far away. You do not need to remember any of it. Not the straits, not the canals, not the stuck ship, not the price of fear, not the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. Let all of it soften and blur and drift gently away. That was never the point. The point is only this: that the vast and solid-seeming world we live in flows, in the end, through a handful of narrow gates. Slender stretches of dark water that most of us will never see, through which the oil and the goods and the very substance of ordinary life are quietly squeezed, night after night, holding up the whole of the world we take for granted. And to a lesson that reaches far beyond ships and straits. That great power often rests in small places, that efficiency and fragility are two faces of the same coin, and that the things we depend upon most completely are so often the things we notice least. There is a strange comfort in it, I think, in knowing that the world is held together by these quiet, narrow places and by the countless people who keep them open through the long nights, so that the rest of us may sleep. That even now, while you rest, the great ships are passing safely through the gates and the world is quietly working, and the things you will need tomorrow are already on their way to you across the dark water. If any of this stayed with you, and you would like another ordinary thing gently taken apart to carry you off to sleep on another night, it is already waiting for you. You do not have to do anything at all. Just subscribe quietly and let the next one find you. And now it is late. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. No gate to keep, no ship to guide, no distant water to watch over. The story is told, and the strait is calm, and the rain is falling softly in the dark. So let your thoughts go loose. Let the ship fade. Let the strait dim. Let the sound of these words become just a soft texture in the dark, like the rain, like the far-off sound of water against a hull, somewhere out on the quiet sea, a long, long way from here. Breathe in, gently. Breathe out. There's nothing to hold on to. Nothing to carry into tomorrow. Just rest now. Night.